domestic politics.
Oh, that's my title, all right.
Yeah.
We better
You
study
gave it
this a
two,
little.
and we chose
Yes.
this one, right?
All right. Well, let me get to the stock market, which I think is a kind of an interesting moment in contemporary Chinese history. But let me sort of step back a bit, maybe, and talk a little bit about the way that people in the United States are looking at recent events in China. And I think there are three or four kind of very obvious things in the last few months. There's the stock market crash. Before that, the housing bubble. There's the currency reevaluation, and now the explosions in Tianjin. And I think kind of a sense of how one should look at that. What if anything, does it mean? And I think the answer to that question really does take us back a bit in terms of what it is that China wants. What is it seeking to become? And equally as important, how does it seek to project itself out into the world? And I think this is a subject of immense importance, because I think if you sort of look at where the drive for China's development comes from, where the energy comes from, and it's an incredibly significant and I think impressive accomplishment that the country can boast over the last 20 years, you do have to wonder, how did this happen? How did this country, which actually had distinguished itself for more than a century as being hopeless, helpless, and weak, and preyed upon, how did it suddenly transform itself? And I think that's a very important question to answer, because it gives us some understanding, I think, of what China is now doing, not only in terms of its tighter controls at home, but the way it's so eagerly and so ardently sort of projecting itself out into the world. And I think that, the simple answer is that it is immensely important to this country to be viewed, as the book that John Deloria and I wrote uses in a title, to be both wealthy, powerful, and I would say a third thing, which was equally, if not more important, to be respected. And I think there's a kind of a confusion often in the minds of the present leadership, which is being pushed by this huge sort of historical impulse for the nation to, this expression in Chinese of a rejuvenation, a fuxing, it's kind of a renaissance, but that has, I think, more cultural implications than a rejuvenation. That this country that was once great fell into ruin, became quasi-colonialized, preyed upon, occupied by Japan, kicked around by the imperialist world, the capitalist world, that finally it came back. And so I think to understand these historical roots, and really the sort of way in which history irrigates this deep yearning for China to restore itself to greatness, is extremely important in trying to figure out almost everything it does, the way it responds to things, the reason why it's so paranoid, the reason why it tends to be so closed, self-emphasizing of control rather than openness, why it is such a, I was thinking, flying here the day before yesterday, it was an entirely different feeling for me to be on a plane coming to Korea rather than a plane going to Beijing. I didn't think, well, should I bring my computer? Should I email people certain things? Am I worried someone's listening in on my phone? this sense that you constantly have to be cautious and wary about what you say, where you say it, how you say it. All of these things, I think, are conditioned by this sort of syndrome that I've described that has deep historical roots, which is this yearning to be respected, be well thought of. And I think the counterpart of that is that the Chinese Communist Party often thinks that they can control the message and control things. They can actually control how people view them. So that's a kind of a long-winded way of saying that these are things that I think you have to kind of factor in to any understanding of why China does what it does and why it reacts to the outside world as it does, and indeed why it reacts to things that go on, whether it's a stock market crash, the explosions in Tianjin, whatever. It has a very unique kind of internal agenda that it's seeking to affect. And in this regard, I would say that of all the countries of consequence in the world, I do think China is among one of the most unresolved countries. And what I mean by that is it isn't yet comfortable with itself, with its culture, which is unclear. What is it? Is it Confucian culture, traditional culture? Is it communist culture, Maoist culture? Is it capitalist culture? Is it Western culture? There's this huge collision of different forces that are playing into its sort of serial effort over the last century, which continues now to reinvent itself. And that creates a kind of a profound, I think, instability at the heart of the matter. I think it also helps condition why you see things like China pushing out into the South China Sea. Why is it doing that? Why is it, I mean, you can say, yes, it wants to protect its supply lines through the Straits of Malacca, et cetera, but why, after having done such a really accomplished job at winning friends throughout Asia, is it now alienating almost everybody? And I think the answer to that is that it is this kind of almost irrepressible urge to have this resurgence of strength and power and to show it. And really to be the sort of reigning presence in the Asia region at least, but also to have a stronger influence around the world. I think these kinds of impulses, both in the South China Sea, the East China Sea with Japan, the tightening down at home, all of the things that you well know about, the arrest of lawyers. I read yesterday they're now going to be sending special lecturers into all universities to lecture on Marxism, Leninism, and to kind of purify ideological thinking. They're putting party branches in private businesses, something which has not happened. There's this effort at home in myriad different ways to control, for fear that the image of China will somehow be unflattering. Now, if you look back at the United States, where I've just come from, I think there is a change going on in the foreign policy community, the likes of which I've not seen in the last, perhaps not since 1989 and the Beijing massacre. There is a profound sense of a need to reappraise, reevaluate, but also a profound sense of uncertainty about what China is doing and why is it doing it, much less how should the United States respond. But if the themes of the last 2.5 decades, since 1989, have been an effort to try to integrate China into the world order, to try to accommodate China in many ways without sort of disturbing them too much with too much sort of confrontational rhetoric and too much challenging them in areas where they might feel rather sensitive to be challenged. Now we find, I think, people in the United States beginning to wonder if we aren't at a tipping point moment when the U.S. response should change. We have the pivot to Asia, the rebalancing, but that it was only, I think, a start of a trend which I see as probably becoming more and more extreme, where some of the old sort of foreign policy assumptions are beginning to make many wonder whether U.S. policy was correct, effective, and whether it should continue. And that is, of course, going to condition what happens in countries like Korea, Japan, and elsewhere around the country. If the U.S. moves into a more confrontational role, and already we see signs of this with the new Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter. He is, I think, of course, his job is defense, to defend against all possibilities. So he is now preparing, I think, different scenarios for China becoming more and more aggressive, belligerent, truculent in the South and East China Seas. And I think, in a certain sense, since he's a very smart man, a respected man, in a funny way, what's happening at the Department of Defense has begun to become sort of the major operating principle about what is happening in Washington in terms of foreign policy. The State Department's quite weak. The Secretary of State is not particularly interested in China. There are very few people in the State Department with a lot of senior people with China experience. The White House is the same. You don't have someone like Hank Paulson, whatever you might think of him. You don't have somebody like Hillary Clinton, who really did care about China and saw China as the key element in any architecture of Asian stability or even world order. She got very discouraged towards the end of her tenure, but she did care. And you remember, she went to China early on, looking for that proverbial sort of reset button, and she didn't find it. So there is something beginning to build, I think, within Washington that will probably only be made more extreme by the presidential election. Because here we have these 18 Republican candidates, whatever it is, 17, 18, 19, who knows, who can keep count? And they're beginning to say things about China. I mean, Donald Trump is blabbering off at the mouth, but you have people like Rubio, who's a Florida senator, who's a Cuban exile. And he is rather anti-communist, and he's now made a statement. We are going to get more and more statements, and they're probably going to be quite hostile in regards to China. And that's going to sort of push, I think, the Democrats, or at least put them on their guard, make it even harder for them to defend integrating China, accommodating China, this assumption that if you just keep trading, if they have an open market, if we do more educational exchanges, more cultural exchanges, slowly China will become more open, more democratic, more like us. That's not been the case. That is where Xi Jinping's so-called China dream, I think, is very important change. Because what the dream is really about, it's about a different direction for China's progress. It's really towards wealth, power, and greater respect. Or you could say an alternative word for respect is fear. There's an element of that too. That's why I think there's a certain satisfaction that China takes at being rather belligerent in the South China Sea, and I should say, getting away with it. Because for a century, more than a century, China couldn't get away with anything. It was completely useless. It had no power, no wealth, no influence. It was just had to lie there and be helped by other people, or occupied by other people, or preyed upon by other people. So I think there's a kind of a sort of psychological feeling of satisfaction that China can begin to go around the world and do what it wants, for better or worse, good or bad. So this is a big challenge. And I think it's a big challenge to everybody. And I don't pretend to really know what it is that China wants and where it's going. But I do think that we see now, we're at a kind of a moment where things are going to begin to change, first of all, between the US and China. We have a summit coming up in September. What are they going to talk about? You know, is Obama going to give Xi Jinping a big hug? I remember I went on the trip when Xi, as vice president, came to America with Vice President Biden. And for several days, you know, I followed them around, and I watched his face. I can't remember a single time when he smiled. He doesn't give away much. It's very hard to know what goes on inside this man, what it is he really wants. He's very cool, very self-contained, and very inaccessible in a certain way. So that it's very difficult to imagine having a personal breakthrough at the presidential level. And moreover, I would say if I read him correctly, again, the truth, the old sort of hope that if we just keep engaging, remember those days when engagement would equal sort of evolutionary progress towards a more comfortable, open, possibly democratic China? Well, Xi Jinping is the reversal of that kind of trend. And I think his toolbox, the things he knows how to do, the way he seeks first to solve problems, was very much conditioned in the Cultural Revolution. And he's not a person who has studied Enlightenment values. We were just talking about this. He's not a person who's been abroad, who speaks another language, who has a kind of an appreciation for the whole sort of idea of a history that's moving towards greater freedom, openness, you know, all of these sort of very Western ideas, which I think in many ways Korea has absorbed some of and Japan has absorbed some of, but I think he is not. He is not a cosmopolitan man. He is a deeply rooted Chinese who has spent his life in a Marxist-Leninist system. Don't think he's much of a Marxist, but I think he's a real Leninist. And that it comes with, of course, the whole Leninist narrative. And what's the Leninist narrative? Well, you remember the one reason why Sun Yat-sen turned to Russia in the 1920s was because Lenin had a theory on anti-imperialism. That the third world, underdeveloped countries of Asia could join the world revolution through this notion that they were being colonialized, imperialized, and oppressed by the great powers and capitalist great powers. So that arrival in China of the sort of Leninist theories on imperialism got woven into this whole Chinese narrative that John and I have written some about, of victimization, of being occupied, humiliated, torn apart by the great powers. Now, Korea is an exception here, but Japan is not. And this is the narrative that I think is deeply embedded into Xi's head, which makes him automatically suspicious of the motives of a country like the United States. And no other country really matters, but certainly suspicious of Japan too, because Japan was also a great power and an imperialist power. And so I think all of these things bode very poorly for a better US-China relationship. And they also make it rather difficult to imagine how it may be that the US and China will come together in a meaningful way. And this is critically important because if the US and China cannot find some way to cooperate and come together, we cannot have any new world order that makes sense. We were just talking about we're going to be going to Vienna together. And there's a conference which Henry Kissinger is going to speak, and his first work, his PhD thesis was on Metternich and the Concert of Europe, Congress of Vienna, 200 years ago this year, when the world was reordered. Sovereign boundaries were drawn, but in those days the world was Europe and Russia. Now the question is, how will the world reorder itself again, given the rise of China? And that question is going to have a very unhappy answer unless the US and China can find some way to be more collaborative and to lead and to take, in some ways, to feel more comfortable with each other. I'm not particularly optimistic about that. But let me, just by way of heading towards a conclusion here, suggest something that I spoke a bit about yesterday. I think if you believe, as I do, that the world is now fundamentally disordered, if you believe it needs order, if you believe that the primary relationship in any world order is the US and China, and that relationship is not in great shape, it's not terrible, but it's not in great shape, and indeed is getting more filled with tension rather than less, well then we have some problems. And countries like Korea and Vietnam and Burma and everyone around the edges is going to have a difficult time knowing where to run, what to do. You go on one side, the other side, you just sort of try to keep really quiet and stay in the middle, hope nobody notices you. There's some sentiment, I think, from some Koreans I've spoken to that just don't say too much. You know, just try to keep trading with Japan, with China, and try to keep a few U.S. troops here and keep the U.S. from getting too upset, and maybe it'll be okay. Well, that's not a great situation. So, what does the future hold? And is there any prospect for breaking this kind of stranglehold of where we're just sort of we can't resolve and we can't move the situation forward in a constructive way between the US and China? Let me pose one thought. When President Obama meets President Xi, this will be the first time since it was November, I believe, in China at the APEC meeting, when they had a sort of a summit meeting on the side of the APEC gathering in Beijing. And towards the very end, they managed to come up with a somewhat hopeful agreement on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Voluntary to be sure, but both sides did commit themselves. How Obama will do this is still not completely clear because the US Congress has sort of lost its mind when it comes to the question of climate change. But basically both countries have agreed that carbon emissions will peak, will reach their top point in 2030. Now, it strikes me that this was an agreement that, from one perspective, had no meaning at all because nobody was forced to do anything. It wasn't a treaty obligation. It wasn't a legal obligation. Obama won't be in office in 2030, and neither will Xi for that matter. But it was still of significance, I believe, because it was the beginning of an expression of, one, a recognition of a problem, common problem, and two, that they felt this was something they needed to do together to solve. Now, it would, if they could really come together around an issue like this, it would help U.S.-China relations, and I think it would also help sort of lead towards some greater order. Now, when has the U.S. come together with China in the past? So let's just do a quick little tour of that. We have the Cold War. I remember when in my passport for years it said, not good for travel to the People's Republic of China. And I spent many years out here in Asia wandering around the different Chinese embassies, wondering if I couldn't somehow get into China. No such luck. We were just separate. And then Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon had something of a revelation. And as you recall, they went to Beijing, and they sort of, that was the beginning of sort of rapprochement, beginning of a convergence of the U.S. and China around a distrust of the Soviet Union. So suddenly, there, out of nowhere, each side perceived a common interest. And it was that sense of that common threat, that common interest, that sustained the relationship over the next, well, really until Deng Xiaoping came to power. And then we could say this was Act Two. Remember, I'm looking for places where we had convergence. So Deng Xiaoping came to power, and he had this policy, as you recall, of reform and opening to the outside world. And part of that reform message in the 1980s was that it would reform economically, but it would also reform politically. A little bit vague, but there was an idea that it was headed in the right direction, and that students started flowing to America and around the world, and exchanges started happening, and there was this kind of sense that, all right, the Western world, the democratic world, and China were at least heading in the same general direction, albeit at different speeds. And then what happened? Act Three. Act Three is 1989 and the Beijing Massacre. And that is when this second sense, I think, of convergence, of common interest, just ended. That was it. The West pulled out, everybody pulled out, and thought, we're not going to have anything to do with these people anymore. It's too savage, too brutal. Slowly, of course, things did knit back together somewhat. But we underwent a period of about, well, it was really 20 years, where we really didn't know what we shared and whether we were with them, whether we were against them, what was their system. They began to restart economic reform, but there wasn't much sign of political reform. But in reality, the absence of political reform became slowly more and more evident, until finally, after this period of sort of drifting, we end up with Act 4. And Act 4 is Xi Jinping. He arrives in office and he proclaims the China Dream. The China Dream is not only a statement that China intends to become wealthy, powerful, and feared, it is in essence the moment when China says, not only are we not going to be reforming politically, but in a rather indirect way, suggesting that there is such a thing as the China model. That China is where it's going. Authoritarian capitalism. Good enough for them, it's working, go look at the high-speed rail, go see our airports, look at the skylines, look at all the amazing things the Chinese have built. And a lot of, I think, Westerners too began to say, well, gosh, not so bad. Maybe this works. Maybe this is the new tomorrow. A little bit George Orwell, yes, but never mind. They put that high-speed rail track down pretty fast. That's nice. And there started to be a lot of sort of questions about whose model, the Western model, liberal democracy with, you know, a market economy, or this other model that suddenly Xi Jinping seemed to be riding on top of with great pride, great arrogance, and no small amount of confidence. And that meant that we shared practically nothing in common. You know, we buy their goods. Sometimes they buy some things from the United States and Europe, but one could say that suddenly the two sides were stripped of any sort of common purpose. And I think that's partially why our relationship now has begun to sort of grow more tense. It's certainly, I think, more uncertain, somewhat lost. And here, I think, we could say that the great challenge of climate change, which is indeed a horrible thing for any person or country on the face of this planet, a tremendous danger and threat. But when it comes to the US and China, it is possibly, I say possibly, could be something of a salvation. Because if in fact the two presidents could come together in a meaningful way on this topic and agree that some of these other things they would just disagree on, but that nobody would push too hard, the South China Sea, that the Chinese might back off, the US might say, well, all right, you know, you can have a sphere of influence there, but we don't recognize territoriality. The United States might consider this isn't the time to put human rights at the top of the list, although I happen myself to be a ardent supporter of human rights. Why? Because we're threatened by climate change. It's a little bit like being invaded by Martians. You know, when the Martians come, even Xi Jinping and President Obama can get together. Now, I don't know if they're going to view it this way, but this is an external threat. It is a threat that involves everybody. It is a threat that will not be solved unless the US and China get together. It doesn't matter what Korea does. It doesn't matter what Japan does, or even Europe. If the US and China don't get together, it's not going to be solved. So I think there is a bit idealistic, maybe. There is a possibility here. I'm not a Henry Kissinger, but if I look at climate change, to me that looks every bit as dangerous as the Soviet Union. And then some. So can this actually galvanize, bring together the US and China? I think countries like Korea and every other country in Asia, and indeed in the world, would be tremendously relieved if the two countries could say, a lot of problems, we don't agree on political systems, we don't like each other's values, we don't like each other's, a lot of things, but you have our word that we are going to put our shoulders behind a solution to global climate change. It would transform, I think, the way the world interacts. And it would certainly transform the way the US and China interact, because we would at last have some common purpose that united us. So, John said yesterday when I mentioned this that I'm somewhat perhaps like this great Chinese writer Lu Xun, who wrote these terribly dark short stories. And then at the end would put some little last sentence that would, in one of his stories, his last sentence after he speaks about humankind as equivalent to cannibals that are eating each other, you know. And the very last line is, "Save the children." And he has some small little sentiment that perhaps there are a few children left we could save. You know, a faint little glimmer of optimism. So I offer this scenario on what I view as a somewhat bleak tableau. I've been trying to figure out China for my whole life. And I have to say, frankly speaking, I feel very, very gloomy. And I look at what's going on in China, and more I don't even want to be there. Because life is too short. Human relations aren't great. People are mistreated. Everything is black is white and white is black. There's so many sort of deceptions and lies, and motivations are confused. It's very hard to feel elevated unless you happen to be in the high-speed rail business by what is going on in China. And so I've learned over my life to listen to reactions that I have, because very often I've learned it is reactions that other people are having too, or ultimately will have. And I think we are on a bit of an edge here. Now, I'm supposed to talk about the stock market. Let me close with that. Why is it important? It's important because it is one of a series of things that now have started to happen to China that symbolize the fact that this model, Xi Jinping, this leadership, are not immortal. They are not invincible. They are not somehow, have not mastered ways to defy the laws that everyone else in the universe has to live by. In other words, they represent a kind of a puncturing, a breaking of the myth of China being some sort of new supermodel of the future. And when I got into watching what was going on with the stock market, I was asked by The Guardian in London to write up. They have a wonderful series called Long Reads. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. And they're like 5,000-word essays. It's very unusual for a newspaper. And they said, write about the stock market. Well, I thought to myself, I don't know anything much about the stock market. But for me, as a writer, those are exactly kind of challenges I like to take up because I can learn. And I did happen to write a very long article back in 1991, I think it was, about the formation of China's stock markets. So I got interested back then when suddenly this strange creature in the middle of this socialist country, they were putting stock markets and futures exchanges and all of these other sort of capitalist mechanisms. It was like having an organ transplant, you know, of some organ from some alien creature being put into your body. And I remember at that time thinking, uh-oh, there's trouble here. You cannot breed a monkey with a cow. You cannot combine these things so facilely, so simply, and expect it all to work out without any problems. Well, we saw the problem recently when the stock market crashed. And it crashed because finally a market needs regulation, but a market is basically a free working system of its own. And the Chinese Communist Party is basically a system that wants to control everything. So what do? On the way up, the Chinese Communist Party published several editorials in the People's Daily and many other places, encouraging people to buy into the stock market. Saying, oh, the bull market is just starting, you know, come on down, go, everybody can get rich. Why did they do that? They did it because state-owned enterprises, which had IPOs and gone onto the market, were deeply in debt. And they could trade debt in these state-owned enterprises for equity amongst the Laobaixing, amongst the common people. And it was a perfect way for them to dissolve an obligation. And so the market went up, 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 and then when it began to crash, that in a certain sense, they felt that it was a kind of a loss of face for them. Because if you pretend to control everything, and everything's just fine, and your country is a model, you can't afford to have something like the stock market crash on you, even though it was not that closely related to the economy itself. And so they intruded. And they went in to sustain it through myriad different mechanisms, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into it. There was a joke in China that they forbade companies from selling stocks. At the same time, they were pumping money into the market to get people to buy stocks. So the joke was that it was illegal. It was illegal to sell and illegal not to buy. Well, that is a high-class manipulation. And the problem with things like that, and the same problem I think with the explosions we've recently seen at the Binhai port in Tianjin, is that, deeply rooted somewheres, and this is again where history plays into what happens in China. I think in the mind of every Chinese, even though they had a cultural revolution that destroyed traditional culture, even though the party has spent decades, attacking superstition and traditional ways of looking at things, every Chinese has this sense of this idea of, Tianming, the mandate of heaven, which basically supposes that there is a kind of a cosmic force that confers on every leadership, every emperor back in the day, the right to rule, the cosmic sort of justification, support to rule. And that when that mandate is broken, the way you know it, the way people can tell that the cosmos no longer favors the dynasty, favors the leadership, is that stuff starts happening. Classic, every dynasty. You have earthquakes, you have floods, you have strange, mystical groups, rebels rising up and attacking. These are the symbols, the hallmarks, the evidence of the end of dynasty, the fin de siècle. And so when these things start happening in succession, there is a kind of an almost autonomic, it's unconscious within people that something is wrong and that the leadership somehow is failing. And so that is why I think the stock market was so important. It wasn't that it was connected so closely to the economy. It wasn't that they let it go a year later, it might have come back. It was that it has this sort of deep, resonant meaning to people in China, exactly what the party's afraid of. They're very superstitious people. I mean, Marxism was supposed to be scientific dialectical materialism, but these guys, they all go to fortune tellers. They're all, what's going on in China today in terms of the flight into religion, for instance, is quite amazing. In Christianity and Buddhism, I mean, you see all these CEOs running around with Buddhist rosaries on their wrists, and they have meditation studios, and they're bringing in their lamas from Tibet, and there's a lot of voodoo aloft in the land of China today, a lot of superstition. So these things really do matter, and I think I began by saying there's something of a tipping point moment going on. I think actually the tipping point moment, if it isn't a real end to the sense of Chinese indestructibility, Chinese omnipotence and invincibility, it is the end of, I think, people being quite so willing to assume that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party know what they're doing. That's a critical moment for any society, because it has to do with the legitimization of a government, with the belief in the power of a government to deliver and to continue forward without breaking step. So anyway, listen, these are just some very rambling thoughts that I have been thinking a lot about. I don't know any better than anyone. I never did where China was going. I get more confused the older I get, and I think it's not surprising because China is an amazing jumble of contradictions. It's a country, as I said, which is not very resolved. It doesn't know where it's going. It doesn't know what it believes in. It doesn't know what its model is. It's feeling its way. And that is creates an incredible amount of sort of instability and sort of psychological uncertainty. And I think we're going to see more of that in the months to come in China. And I think actually the only good side, by way of conclusion, I'll say that might come out of this is that if it makes China a little more humble, a little less arrogant, a little bit more aware that it exists in a larger global context, and that just as climate change is the metaphor for everybody being dependent on everybody else, if Chinese leaders could be reminded in a way that didn't completely upset the Chinese dream and China's progress forward, that they are dependent on people around them. They have to listen to other people. They have to make concessions. They have to make agreements. They have to give a little, get a little. If that were to happen, and I am not optimistic, that would be a great thing.
Thanks. Very gloomy picture. All